The evening sky painted itself in soft hues of purple and orange as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. A gentle wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. In a quiet corner of the world, far from the bustling noise of towns or villages, stood an old, weather-beaten house. Its wooden walls, though faded, spoke of a life lived in solitude. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow that filled the small, cluttered space with the comfort of home. Martha, an elderly artist, sat at her easel, her paintbrush dancing across the canvas as she worked on her latest piece. Though she had lived here for decades, the isolation never bothered her. She had long ago grown accustomed to the silence, finding solace in the rhythm of the seasons and the company of her own thoughts. The forest surrounding her house was her sanctuary, a place of peace and inspiration. It was during one of these tranquil evenings that something unexpected appeared at the edge of her yard. A small, dirty figure, stumbling through the underbrush, caught her attention. At first, she thought it might be a rabbit or some other small creature, but as it drew closer, her heart skipped a beat. It was a fox cub, its fur matted and brown with dirt, its eyes wide and fearful. Martha stood, startled for a moment, but something in the cub's gaze made her heart soften. There was a sadness in those eyes, an unspoken plea for help. It wasn't the usual wild fear she'd seen in animals, but something deeper, more desperate. Without a second thought, Martha moved toward the creature, her old bones creaking with each step, but her heart warm with the instinct to care. She crouched down slowly, her hand reaching out cautiously. The cub flinched, its tiny body trembling, but it didn't run. Martha's voice, soft and gentle, broke the stillness of the evening. "Come here, little one," she whispered, her voice carrying a soothing warmth. "You're safe now." The fox cub hesitated for a moment, then, as if it had made a decision, it shuffled closer to her outstretched hand. Martha stroked its back gently, feeling the rough texture of its fur beneath her fingers. It was so thin, so fragile, as if it had been wandering for days, possibly weeks, without food or shelter. She stood up, carefully lifting the cub into her arms. The little one didn't struggle, but instead seemed to nestle closer to her, seeking warmth and comfort. Martha's heart ached at the sight. She wasn't sure where the cub had come from, but she knew it needed help, and she would provide that help. Inside, she placed the cub gently on a soft blanket by the fire, offering it some food. The cub sniffed at the offering but didn't eat right away, still wary and unsure. Martha sat down nearby, watching the creature with a mix of concern and curiosity. She couldn't help but wonder where it had come from, and why it had wandered so far from its natural home. As she sat there, lost in thought, the cub eventually ate, though only small amounts. The fire crackled, and the wind outside continued its gentle song. Martha smiled faintly, feeling a deep connection to this little creature, this fragile life that had somehow found its way to her doorstep. She decided to name the cub Whis, short for whisper, because it moved so silently, like the wind, barely making a sound as it crept closer to her. It seemed fitting, somehow, for this quiet soul who had come to her without warning, bringing with it the promise of something new, something precious. That night, as Martha drifted off to sleep in her chair, her mind wandered to thoughts of Whis. She had a feeling that this little fox wasn't just any ordinary animal. There was something about its presence, something mysterious, almost magical. But for now, she let those thoughts slip away into the darkness, trusting that tomorrow would bring clarity. The days that followed were filled with quiet routine. Martha tended to Whis with care, offering food, a warm place to sleep, and the company of her soft-spoken voice. But despite her best efforts, the fox remained distant, a silent observer, never fully trusting. It was as though a part of it was still tethered to the wild, still unsure if it could belong to this small, human world. Martha was patient, understanding that trust took time, especially for an animal so clearly used to the harsh realities of nature. She would sit beside Whis, talking to it as if it were a dear friend, telling stories about her life, her paintings, the days spent alone in the quiet of her home. At first, the fox didn't respond. It only watched her with its large amber eyes, ears twitching at the sounds of her voice, but not offering any sign of recognition. But Martha didn't mind. She wasn't looking for a quick bond. She simply wanted to be there for Whis, to provide comfort and safety. Slowly, over the course of the next few days, Whis began to grow more accustomed to Martha's presence. It started with small movements, a tilt of the head, a softening of its stance as it sat near the fire, no longer retreating when Martha drew near. Sometimes it would allow her to gently stroke its fur, though it still flinched at the slightest touch. In the quiet of the evenings, Martha would sit at her easel, working on her paintings, and Whis would curl up beside her, watching her brush strokes with curiosity. It was almost as if the fox had become a part of her creative process, silently observing the world Martha captured on canvas. Martha, in turn, began to paint Whis, capturing the fox's ethereal beauty, the way it moved so delicately, like a shadow, its eyes full of both wisdom and sadness. But despite the growing bond between them, something remained unsettling. Every night, without fail, Whis would disappear into the woods. At first, Martha didn't think much of it. After all, the fox was wild by nature, and the forest was its home. But as the days passed, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of worry each time Whis slipped away into the night. She never knew where it went, but it always returned by morning, its fur ruffled and its eyes tired, as though it had been on a long journey. Sometimes it would appear with dirt and twigs in its fur, as if it had been running through the underbrush or wandering through the thick woods surrounding her home. It wasn't the behavior of a domesticated animal, but Martha didn't want to intrude. She understood that Whis had a life beyond the house, a life that couldn't be contained within the walls of her cottage. One night, however, Martha couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked under its force. She lay in bed, listening to the storm as it raged against the world. Her thoughts wandered back to Whis. She had noticed the fox's increasing exhaustion in the mornings, the way its movements had become sluggish, its fur less shiny. Whis had been growing weaker with each passing day, though it had not shown any sign of illness. The sound of claws scratching lightly against the door startled her. It was a familiar sound. Whis had returned. Martha got up, moved to the door, and opened it carefully, half expecting to find the little fox once again curled up on the porch. But this time, when she opened the door, there was no small fox waiting to greet her. Instead, the night was still, and the storm had quieted, leaving only the soft sound of rain tapping against the window pane. She stood there for a moment, puzzled. Had Whis gone further into the forest? Or perhaps it had found a more sheltered place to rest from the storm. But as Martha stepped back inside, she heard a faint rustling from the woods, something different, heavier, more deliberate. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized it wasn't just Whis. Something else was out there, something more than just the usual creatures of the forest. Her curiosity piqued. Martha grabbed a lantern and stepped cautiously outside, the cold wind biting at her cheeks. She walked into the woods, following the sound of movement, her feet crunching softly against the wet ground. The rustling grew louder as she approached a clearing. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting a silver glow across the forest floor. And there, standing in the center of the clearing, was Whis. But this time, the sight was different. The fox wasn't alone. Behind Whis, nestled in the underbrush, were 3 tiny kits, fox pups no older than a few weeks. Their eyes were still closed, their bodies trembling as they huddled together for warmth. Whis stood protectively over them, her body tense, her gaze shifting between the pups and Martha. It was then that Martha realized the truth. Whis wasn't a young cub, as she had first thought. Whis was a mother. A sense of awe filled Martha as she watched the scene before her. The bond between the fox and her kits was undeniable, a bond stronger than anything Martha had ever witnessed. And yet, there was a sadness in Wiss's eyes, a longing for something Martha couldn't quite understand. The little family stood there in the moonlight, their fur glowing like silver in the night. Martha's heart ached with the realization that Whis, despite the safety of her home, was still a creature of the wild, torn between 2 worlds. The following days were filled with uncertainty and quiet contemplation. Martha found herself torn between 2 worlds. The world of the human life she had built in this remote corner of the forest, and the wild, untamed world that Whis was bound to. The sight of the fox mother and her kits lingered in Martha's mind, keeping her awake at night as she wrestled with a growing sense of responsibility. Martha continued to care for Whis, ensuring she had enough food and warmth, while she also tried to respect the fox's need for freedom. The small family seemed to move between the house and the forest with fluidity. Whis would return every morning, weary but content, always checking on her kits in the shelter of the underbrush. Despite the fox's quiet nature, Martha noticed something had shifted. Whis's eyes held a softness when she looked at Martha, as if the fox had accepted her presence. But there was also a subtle hesitance in the way Whis moved, as though she was constantly aware of the pull of the wild calling her back. But then, one evening, a storm unlike any Martha had seen before began to brew in the sky. The wind howled through the trees, bending the branches and causing the leaves to scatter like confetti. The dark clouds swirled with a ferocity that unsettled Martha, and she hurried to secure the windows and doors of her house, bracing herself for what was sure to be a long, wild night. She didn't know why, but a deep feeling of unease settled in her stomach. Whis had been absent that morning, and despite the growing storm, Martha had expected the fox to return by nightfall. But as the hours passed and the rain began to pour in sheets, Whis didn't show up. Martha, as she sat by the fire, a knitting needle in her hands, glanced out the window anxiously, watching the storm rage outside. The wind howled like a wild animal, the trees bending and swaying in its force. Whis's absence was troubling her more than usual. The night dragged on, and still there was no sign of Whis. The storm grew worse, the lightning flashing through the sky in violent streaks, followed by the deafening roar of thunder. Martha couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. Whis had never stayed away this long. Her heart raced with worry as she stood up and moved toward the door, but she hesitated. The storm was fierce, and the woods were treacherous at night, especially now. Yet Martha couldn't sit still. She had to know what had happened to the fox. She grabbed a lantern, pulled on her thick woolen coat, and stepped outside into the howling storm. The rain hit her like needles, and the wind nearly knocked her off her feet, but she pressed on, determined to find Whis and make sure she was safe. She ventured into the woods, her lantern flickering in the fierce wind, casting shadows across the trees. The forest seemed alive, the sound of the storm mixing with the crashing of the waves in the nearby river. She called out for Whis, but the wind swallowed her voice, making her words barely audible even to herself. The deeper Martha went into the woods, the darker it became, the shadows of the trees almost seeming to close in around her. The storm had transformed the familiar woods into an eerie and foreboding landscape. It felt as though nature itself was warning her to turn back. But she couldn't. The thought of Whis, of the kits, and of the fragile bond they had formed pushed her forward. After what felt like an eternity, she reached the clearing where she had first found the fox family. It was then that she saw it. Whis, lying in the mud, exhausted and soaked through to the bone. Martha's heart sank. The fox mother was struggling, her body weak and trembling. She was not alone. Beside her, huddled in the rain, were the 3 kits, their tiny bodies shivering in the cold. They had been caught in the storm, and though Martha could see that they were alive, they looked fragile and helpless, their small bodies trembling from the cold. Wiss's eyes met Martha's, and for the first time, there was no wariness in her gaze. There was only pain and desperation. The fox mother was exhausted, and it was clear that she had pushed herself to the limit in order to protect her kits. She had brought them to this clearing to keep them safe, but now they were trapped in the storm, vulnerable and alone. Martha dropped to her knees beside them, her heart breaking at the sight of the fox family in distress. Without hesitation, she scooped up the kits, one by one, and cradled them in her arms, keeping them warm as best as she could. Whis, too, seemed to give up her resistance. She allowed Martha to help her, her body too weak to fight. Martha could feel the fox's quiet gratitude. But there was no time to waste. The storm was raging harder with each passing minute. Martha knew what she had to do. She lifted Whis into her arms, the fox's small body shaking against her. She couldn't leave them here. The storm would only get worse, and they would not survive if she did not act quickly. She carried the fox and her kits back to the safety of her house, every step a struggle against the wind and rain. When she finally reached the warmth and shelter of her home, Martha laid the fox family gently on the floor by the fire, wrapping them in blankets. The kits, though still trembling, were safe. Whis curled up protectively around them, her body exhausted, but her heart at ease, knowing she was no longer alone in the storm. Martha sat beside them, her clothes soaked through and her body weary, but she felt a sense of fulfillment. Whis had trusted her, and in that moment, Martha understood the weight of that trust. The fox mother had made her choice. She had chosen to return to Martha's care, even in the face of the wild storm. It was as though the bond between them had finally solidified, a silent understanding that they would protect each other, no matter what. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the forest washed clean, its air fresh and crisp. The sky was pale and cloudless, the sun's rays warming the damp earth. Inside Martha's house, the fire crackled softly, and the fox family lay curled together near the hearth, their small bodies nestled in blankets. Whis, though still weak, looked calmer now, her eyes no longer filled with the frantic desperation that had overtaken her the night before. She lay with her kits, watching them as they slept, her gaze soft but filled with a quiet sadness. Martha, though exhausted, had not yet found the peace she longed for. Her heart felt heavy as she watched Whis, the fox mother whose life had been so torn between two worlds, the human world and the wild one that called to her from the depths of the forest. It was clear to Martha that Whis could not remain here forever. As much as she had grown attached to the fox and her kits, she knew that the wild would always be in Whis's blood. No matter how much Martha cared for her, the forest was where Whis truly belonged. For a long time, Martha simply sat there in silence, watching the fox family. She wondered how long they would stay. Whis was strong, but her body still bore the marks of exhaustion from the storm, and her kits, though surviving, were frail. They would need time to recover and grow stronger. But Martha knew that time was short. As much as she longed to keep Whis by her side, the fox's spirit was not one that could be caged. The wild was calling her back. Martha had made up her mind. She would help Whis, but she could no longer keep her in the safety of her home. The bond between them had been forged, but now it was time to let go. She spent the day in quiet reflection, preparing for what was to come. She set out food and water for Whis and the kits, knowing that their strength would return with time. The fox mother seemed to understand. She ate lightly but nursed her young, her protective instincts still strong. Martha could see the shift in Whis, the gentle acceptance of what had happened, the understanding that she had found a temporary haven, but would soon need to leave again. That night, Martha sat beside the fire with the foxes, her hands trembling as she worked on her paintings. The storm had washed away much of her worry, but she couldn't help feeling the weight of the choice that loomed before her. The kits were still small, fragile, but they were strong enough to survive now. Whis, too, was recovering, but her gaze kept straying to the window, to the distant forest, where the wind whispered secrets of the wild. Martha knew that Whis had to make a choice of her own. She could stay with Martha's care, or she could return to the forest, to the life she had known before. There was no place for Whis in Martha's world beyond these fleeting moments of refuge. The wild would always call to her. As Martha sat there, the fire casting shadows on the walls, Whis stood and padded toward the door. Her movements were slow but purposeful, and Martha knew, without a doubt, that Whis had made her decision. The fox mother turned back toward Martha, her eyes meeting the elderly woman's for the briefest of moments, as if silently asking for her understanding. And in that moment, Martha realized that she had never really been holding Whis in her care. She had simply been a passage, a resting place along the fox's journey. Martha rose from her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the door, opening it wide to the night. The wind had picked up again, its whispers carrying with it the unmistakable scent of the forest. Whis stood in the doorway, her kits nestled at her side, looking out at the moonlit world beyond. Martha knew what she had to do. She moved toward the fox family, her heart heavy but full of love. She placed her hands on Whis's back, stroking it gently, offering her the comfort she had given so freely. Whis looked up at her, her amber eyes reflecting the soft glow of the lantern, and Martha could see the thankfulness in them, the gratitude for the care she had received, but also the understanding that it was time to return. Martha took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. "Go, Whis," she said, her voice filled with both sadness and resolve. "You belong to the forest, to the wild, and so do your kits. But know this, You will always have a place here, in my heart." With a soft sigh, Whis turned and stepped out into the night, her kits following closely behind. They moved silently, like shadows, slipping into the forest where they belonged. As they disappeared into the trees, Martha felt a pang in her chest, a mixture of loss and love. She closed the door quietly and turned back to the warmth of the fire. The Fox family was gone, but in Martha's heart they remained. And though her house was now empty, a deep peace settled over her, knowing that Whis had found her way back to the wild, to the life she had always known. Days passed, and life in Martha's cottage returned to its quiet rhythm. The wind, now soft and steady, rustled through the trees, whispering the stories of the forest to the world beyond. Yet, for Martha, the world had changed in ways she couldn't fully explain. Her house was quieter now without the soft padding of fox paws on the wooden floors, without the gentle rustling of fur against the blankets. The fire no longer crackled in the presence of Whis and her kits, but in the silence, Martha felt something deep within her. Something that was both an ache and a warmth. She spent her days painting, as she always had, but the landscapes she captured on canvas seemed different now. Her strokes were lighter, more fluid, and though her subjects remained the same, the rolling hills, the gentle flow of the nearby river, the trees that lined the horizon, there was something new in them. Something inspired by the quiet strength of the Fox family, by Wys's silent journey between two worlds. Martha hadn't expected to miss them as much as she did. She had always been alone in the forest, had always found solace in her solitude. But something had changed in her heart after meeting Whis. She had opened herself up, allowed her heart to stretch beyond the confines of her own world, and in return, she had been given the gift of understanding, the deep, unspoken bond between all creatures, wild and tame. And so, she painted. Each canvas became a tribute to the foxes, to the brief time they had shared, and to the whispers of the wind that carried them away. Whis had chosen the wild, as Martha knew she must, but Martha would always carry the memory of their time together. On the mornings when the wind was especially strong, when it howled through the trees like a long-lost friend, Martha would pause, her brush hovering above the canvas, and listen. There were moments, just brief moments, when the rustling of the leaves seemed to call her name, when the wind seemed to whisper stories of Whis and her kits, stories of their lives in the forest, growing stronger, thriving in the wild that was their true home. One particular morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Martha felt the breeze pick up, a soft whisper that seemed almost familiar. She stood still for a moment, her hand resting on the window-sill, listening closely. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth and pine, a reminder of the storm that had passed, and in that moment, Martha knew Whis was still out there. As the days turned into weeks, Martha grew more and more convinced that the connection she had felt with the Fox family wasn't just a passing thing. The wind, which had always carried with it the sound of nature's secrets, now seemed to carry the very essence of Whis, the soft rustle of leaves, the call of the forest, and the quiet murmur of life that continued on beyond the edge of her home. Martha's thoughts often drifted back to the day she had let Whis go, standing in the doorway and watching as the Fox family disappeared into the woods. She had cried then, feeling the weight of the loss. But now, as the days passed and the seasons shifted, those tears had transformed into something deeper, into a quiet sense of peace. She had given Whis the freedom she needed, the life she deserved, and in doing so, she had let go of a part of herself, too. The first snow of the season arrived quietly, blanketing the forest in a soft, silent hush. Martha's world had grown quieter still, the days colder, and the nights longer. She spent her days painting, capturing the beauty of winter, the stark contrasts of the snow against the dark trees, the quiet serenity of the forest at rest. The snow had a stillness to it that mirrored the feeling that had settled in Martha's heart, an understanding that though Whis and her kits were no longer a part of her daily life, they were never truly gone. And then, one evening, as Martha sat by the fire, knitting a blanket for the coming winter, she heard it. The soft rustle of paws on the porch, the faintest scratch at the door. Her heart skipped a beat, and without thinking, she stood and moved toward the door. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the handle, half expecting the wind to be playing tricks on her. But when she opened the door, she froze. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was Whis, the fox mother, now looking stronger, her fur sleek and glowing in the pale light of the moon. But she was not alone. Standing beside her were the kits, now grown, their fur thick and well-kept, their eyes bright with the same golden glow that Whis had always carried. For a moment, they all stood there, watching Martha, the air thick with a sense of recognition, a quiet understanding between them all. Martha's heart swelled with emotion as she gazed at the family before her. The kits were no longer tiny, helpless creatures. They were young adults now, strong and independent, their wildness as evident as Wiss's own. They had grown, they had survived, and they had found their way back to the one who had once cared for them. Wiss's amber eyes met Martha's, and in that gaze there was no need for words. It was as if the fox mother was telling Martha that she had not forgotten her, that the bond they had shared had not been broken. They had come back, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to, because they carried with them the memory of the kindness Martha had shown them. For a long moment, they simply stood there, watching each other. The wind, which had been so quiet all evening, seemed to stir in the trees, rustling the branches as though it, too, was acknowledging the return of the fox family. And then, as silently as they had arrived, Whis and her kits turned and vanished into the night, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Martha stood in the doorway, a smile on her face, her heart full. She knew, deep down, that the fox family was where they belonged out there, in the wild, free and untamed. But in her heart, they would always have a place. For in the wind's whispers, in the rustling of the trees, Martha could still hear them, and she knew that Whis, her kits, and the bond they had shared would remain forever. Months passed, and winter settled over the land like a soft white blanket. The once vibrant forest, now draped in snow, had transformed into a quiet, frozen wonderland. Martha's small cottage stood at the edge of the woods, a warm beacon against the harshness of the cold. Inside, the fire crackled merrily, casting its golden glow across the room, but the hearth felt empty without the presence of Whis and her kits. Though Martha had come to terms with the fox family's departure, the solitude of winter sometimes pressed in on her, making the house feel even lonelier. The snow, so peaceful and serene during the day, seemed to deepen the silence at night. The days were long, and the nights longer still. Yet, despite the quiet, Martha had grown accustomed to the stillness. She had filled her time with painting, with knitting, and with reflecting on the many seasons she had spent in her little house by the forest. Whis had become a distant memory, a cherished one, but a memory nonetheless. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the snowflakes danced in the cold air, Martha sat by the fire, knitting a scarf for herself. The gentle crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room, and she felt a familiar sense of peace settle over her. She had learned, over the months, to embrace the solitude. She had even begun to find joy in it, painting the snow-covered landscape outside her window and adding little touches of warmth to the otherwise quiet world around her. But, as the firelight flickered in the dim room, Martha felt a sudden shift. A familiar feeling washed over her, a sensation that she could not quite place, but knew all the same. It was a soft rustling sound, like the movement of paws in the snow. She froze, the knitting needle still in her hand, and her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? She stood up slowly, her breath catching in her throat. She had no idea what had drawn her attention to the door at that very moment, but she felt a strange certainty that something was out there, something familiar. Her mind raced as she walked toward the door, her fingers brushing against the cool wood. The wind outside had picked up, and the sound of the storm seemed to drown out all else, but she could still hear it, faint but unmistakable, the gentle scratch at the door. Martha's heart pounded in her chest as she turned the handle. The door opened with a soft creak, and there, standing at the threshold, was Whis. The fox mother stood with her head slightly tilted, her amber eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She was not alone this time. Her kits, now nearly grown, stood beside her, their fur thick and healthy, their eyes filled with the same curious light that Whis had always carried. For a moment, they simply stared at Martha, as if unsure of what to do next. Martha's breath caught in her throat. She felt a rush of emotions, surprise, wonder, and something deeper, something that stirred within her chest. The sight of them, standing there in the soft glow of the lantern light, was enough to make her heart swell with joy. They had come back. After all these months, they had returned. She stepped back from the door, her hand trembling slightly. "Whis," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You came back." The fox mother's eyes met hers, and in that moment, Martha could see the recognition in her gaze, the same silent bond they had shared before. Whis had not forgotten her. And though she had returned to the wild, there was something in her that still called Martha a part of her world. The kits, too, seemed to recognize Martha, their eyes soft and curious as they took tentative steps into the warmth of the house. They were no longer the fragile creatures that had once been so dependent on their mother's care. They had grown strong, their bodies lean and agile, their fur gleaming in the firelight. They were wild, but there was a trace of the kindness Martha had shown them that lingered in their gaze. Martha felt tears well up in her eyes as she stepped forward, her hands outstretched. The kits approached her slowly, one by one, their tails flicking in curiosity. She crouched down to meet them, her heart full of warmth as she stroked their fur. Whis watched silently, her amber eyes never leaving Martha's face, as if giving her permission to connect with her children. The bond between them was undeniable. Whis had brought her kits back, but there was no mistaking that she had done so for a reason. Perhaps it was to show Martha that her place in their lives would always be there, even if the foxes had returned to their wild home. They had returned not out of need, but out of a quiet recognition that Martha was part of their story, part of their journey. For a long time, the four of them sat together by the fire, Martha, Whis, and the two young foxes. The room was warm and peaceful, and the world outside seemed far away. There was no need for words, for the bond between them was beyond speech. It was in the simple act of sharing this quiet moment, in the gentle presence of the foxes that had once found refuge in her home. And then, as suddenly as they had arrived, Whis and her kits turned toward the door. The night outside was still and cold, the snow falling in soft, glittering flakes, but Martha knew that their visit was fleeting. They had come to show her that they had not forgotten, that the bond between them was not one that could be broken by distance or time. They had returned, but only for a moment, to remind Martha that she was part of their story, just as they were part of hers. With one final glance back at Martha, Whis and her kits disappeared into the night, vanishing into the snow-covered woods as silently as they had come. Martha stood at the door, her heart full, knowing that the Fox family would always have a place in her life, in her heart, and that, no matter where they roamed, they would always be connected by the whisper of the wind.